What's the scariest or creepiest incident you've seen, but no one believes you? Story one, I used to have this reoccurring nightmare about this lizard man type monster who could see what I could see out of my eyes. So I would run and hide and he would not know where I was. But then as soon as I peeked to see if it was safe, he would know exactly where I was. So I would have to leave that hiding spot and go find a new one. And then it would happen over and over and over again. A literal nightmare. Very Kafkaesque. But here's the real spooky part. I once mentioned the lizard man to my dad, and he turned completely white in the face. His voice got shaky, and he just asked if this dream took place at our house in East St. Paul, the one with the apartments right behind it. I said yes, that was where I would always go to hide, and I asked how he knew that, and he said it was because he had the exact same dream. I do not know if it was the way he said it or the overall situation or both, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and it is quite chilling. Story two, I was really young, about 8 years old, and I was at my grandmother's house for vacation. I went for a walk in the neighborhood, and the area there has a hill that goes into the sea. While I was walking, a car at tremendous speed flew off the hill and landed in the sea. I was terrified and ran into a nearby house to tell them to call the police. They did not believe me and said they would call the police, but they never did, which I later learned. After about 1 week, a person was reported missing, and then I told my grandmother about the incident and exactly where it happened. She called the police, and they found the car with the body inside. It turned out that the man had personal problems and had taken his own life, and if only that woman had believed me, maybe this man would still be alive. Story three. One night some years ago, I was moving out of an apartment where I had been living alone. I had spent the last 5 days moving my things out and only had a few items left in a closet. After almost fully clearing the closet, I noticed serious damage to the interior wall hidden behind an ironing board that I never used. A huge chunk of the wall was missing, and there was drywall debris on the closet floor, which made me nervous because I knew I might lose my security deposit. After moving everything out of the way, I noticed that the space in the wall dropped down into what I assumed was the same closet in the apartment below me, and I immediately suspected mice or rats because I had seen them do this exact thing before, chewing through everything. I grabbed a flashlight to look down and see if there were animals down there, and whether I needed to call someone, and when I stuck my head into the hole and shined the light, it was surprisingly clear, except there was a small ladder inside leading up into my closet. I quietly panicked and turned off the flashlight, and I saw light being cast into the space from the lower floor, along with a shadow moving, as if someone had been standing there and moved when I turned the light off. I yanked the ladder out, damaging the wall even more in the process, ran out across the street to a Denny's parking lot, and called the police. As soon as I hung up, I saw the blinds in my window part open for a few seconds and then close again. The police arrived within minutes and detained my downstairs neighbor, and it turned out he had not left his apartment in almost 3 years and had developed paranoid schizophrenia, which caused him to enter my apartment when I was away. The worst part is that I remembered hearing crying and wailing sounds coming from my closet as far back as 1 year before I moved out. Long wails that would start and stop in the middle of the night. He was not charged with anything and was living in a halfway house the last time I heard, about 4 years ago. Story four. About 1.5 years ago, I moved into my current apartment, where I was living alone at that time. 1 or 2 days after signing the lease and getting the keys, I was slowly moving my belongings out of my previous room, and my former housemates, 2 women, helped me drop off some furniture and boxes of books. As we drove away in their truck, I felt unsure about whether I had closed the front door all the way, but I reassured myself and told myself to stop being paranoid. I came back that night by myself and the door was shut tight, just as I thought. I unlocked it, walked in, turned on the one tiny wall light, and locked the door behind me. On a small table by the front door was an object, even though I had not unpacked any small items like that yet. I looked at it more closely under the light and realized it was a black cloth durag, the kind some men use to cover their hair. I actually kept walking into the bedroom while thinking about the strange appearance of this item before it fully registered that it was not mine and did not belong to my old housemates, meaning somebody else had been inside. I acted casual as if I had forgotten something, turned around, walked back out the front door, got into my car, drove several blocks away, and then pulled over to call the police. I re-entered the apartment with two police officers, and although the door was shut when we arrived, no one was hiding anywhere, and the apartment was empty. Because I had driven away, I never saw whether anyone left after me, and I will never know if there really was a stranger inside waiting in the dark. Maybe he saw the door open, realized there was nothing worth stealing, and left the durag behind to scare me. Or maybe he realized he lost his chance when I left and escaped. It has been more than 1 year since then, and strangely enough, I feel perfectly safe living here now, although I no longer live alone. Story 5. I work for a funeral home. In 2 to 3 nights per week, I am the one on call if someone passes away during the night and needs to be picked up outside of office hours. The funeral home is fairly new, built from scratch only about 10 years ago. When you arrive, you park the van in the garage, walk through the refrigerator room, then go down an L-shaped hallway that takes you around the chapel until you reach the door to the main office. The creepy part is that when you make that walk from the back to the main office, it often sounds like there are two people talking in another room, the kind of sound where you can tell people are speaking through a wall but cannot understand what they are saying. It only happens when it is dark outside or when the funeral home has been empty for a few hours, and I have tried listening for it during the day, but I never hear it then. It always puts me a bit on edge, and the light switches are designed in a way that forces you to walk all the way down the dark hallways, listening to what sounds like ghostly chatter before you reach the switch, which is not ideal at all. Story 6. I used to work as a pharmacist in a hospital, and I was on the night shift when this happened. I was on my way to get dinner from the cafeteria at around 8 in the evening, and the cafeteria was located in a different building from the pharmacy. Because this was in a developing country, electricity was not always available, so at night they would switch on a generator if there was no power. To conserve fuel, not all walkways were lit when the generator was running. I was walking along the walkways, which were raised about 1.5 feet from the ground, when a small goat suddenly jumped up onto the walkway from nowhere and started charging toward me. It was dark, and I was afraid that if I ran back toward the pharmacy, I would fall off the walkway, and I was also the only one working there at the time, so I could not get help. Every time I stepped to the side, the goat followed me, and I tried to scare it away by shooing it and kicking in its direction, but it was not deterred at all. I eventually managed to get past it and ran all the way to the cafeteria with the goat right at my heels. As soon as I stepped into the cafeteria doorway and looked back, I could no longer see the goat. I got my food and was terrified to walk back, but I never saw the goat again. I never really told anyone about this because I was afraid they would think I was imagining things. Story 7. My grandfather died before I was born, and one time when I was about 10 or 11 years old, I went to the bathroom and then stood in front of the sink to wash my hands. I did not turn on the lights because I was only going to be there for a moment, and the toilet was in a separate small room next to the bathroom. There was a skylight in the bathroom, so it was still bright enough for me to see clearly. As I finished washing my hands and looked up into the mirror, I did not see my own reflection, but instead saw an old man with a thick mustache looking back at me. I stood there staring straight at him for at least a full minute, my heart racing, but I did not actually feel scared. He had a familiar and friendly face and looked at me almost affectionately. After about a minute, I ran out of the bathroom and back into the living room where my family was. I never told my family about what I saw, but I did tell my best friend at the time, and he actually believed me. At first, I was not sure who I had seen in the mirror, but a few weeks later, we were looking through old photo albums, and I saw a picture of my grandfather and immediately knew it was him. When I was around 6 years old, my mother was very interested in psychic topics and had a psychic visit our house. And the woman told my mother that she sensed a spirit following me and that it was protecting me. I still do not know if I truly believe in ghosts or anything like that, but I remember that experience very vividly to this day. Story 8. I have had 2 paranormal incidents, one when I was younger and the other during high school. At that time, my mother went to Thailand for a month, so it was just my father and me at home. One morning, I woke up a bit earlier than usual and ended up playing on my phone while still lying in bed. I was curled up in the fetal position, facing the wall, and eventually I got tired of lying on my right side, so I sat up while still looking at my phone. At some point, I looked up and saw a figure standing within the curtains, about 2 meters tall from the bottom to the top of the curtain. The curtain was draped over him, and I could clearly make out broad shoulders and a strong outline of a head. He was facing the window looking outside. Within about 5 seconds, as the fear built up from realizing someone was in my room, the curtain suddenly collapsed where the figure had been. There was no wind, no draft under the door, and the door was locked. A similar incident happened when I was even younger. My mother called me to go get my father for dinner, so I went to his room and saw a figure standing within the curtains again. The windows were wide open, and there was a strong flow of wind blowing through both sides, but the weight of the figure standing in the middle stopped the curtains from blowing all the way up. Thinking it was my father, I walked up to him and told him that dinner was ready. There was something deeply unsettling about that moment, because the figure slowly turned its head and looked at me, then turned back toward the window in complete silence. I completely froze. Then I heard water splashing coming from the bathroom and assumed my father was bathing. I called out to him and got no answer. And that is when the fear truly hit me, and I ran straight back to the dining room. It was the same figure in both experiences, and while I have not seen anything like that since, I have never forgotten those moments. I do not really believe in paranormal things, but this is something I have never been able to explain. Story 9. I moved into a new house when I was about 12 years old, and my brother was around 10. There was a crawl space in the basement that still had some old items in it, and my brother and I found one of those old lawn dart sets that were later banned because they were considered too dangerous. We set them up and started playing, and those darts were unbelievably accurate in the worst way, because almost every time you threw one, it seemed to hit someone. You could aim them carefully, but they would fly in strange and unpredictable directions, and both my brother and I ended up getting hurt. My mother eventually threw them away, and I did not think about them again for a very long time. I moved out when I was 19 and got my first place on my own, and I found a couch at a thrift store that I kept for about a year. One day while lying on that couch, I experienced what I assumed was sleep paralysis. I saw a pillow move out of the corner of my eye, and once I was able to move, I ran to the bathroom and splashed water on my face, only to have the bathroom door slam shut behind me while I was completely alone at home. I managed to calm myself down, went back, and sat on the couch again when I suddenly felt a sharp pain from inside it. I jumped up, looked down, and saw the metal spike of a lawn dart sticking out from the inside of the couch. I actually had to cut the couch open to remove it, and to this day, it made absolutely no sense to me. Story 10. I once found an old abandoned grain elevator, a tall concrete and brick building that looked like a giant silo, just outside the town where I went to college. I have always loved exploring abandoned buildings, and after driving past it a few times, I convinced my girlfriend to go check it out with me. Once we were inside, it was easy to understand the layout because there was not much to it. There was a very small basement with a dirt floor, and the ground level was basically one wide main hallway with a single narrow hallway that led into the actual silo area. There was also a ladder made of very rusty metal rings sticking out of the concrete, and this ladder went up about 30 feet to what looked like a small storage space at the top of the silo. There was no chance I was going to climb it, and it looked extremely unsafe for anyone to even attempt. I explained the layout because after about 10 minutes inside, my girlfriend and I both clearly heard very heavy footsteps. It sounded like a large man wearing heavy boots walking on a wooden floor, even though there was no wooden floor anywhere in the building. The footsteps were loud and unmistakable, and we immediately looked at each other to make sure we were both hearing the same thing. We ran out of there as fast as we could, and we still could not figure out where the sounds could have come from, unless someone very large had climbed that dangerous ladder and was walking around at the top. It remains one of the creepiest encounters of my life. Story 11. When I was 18 years old, my grandfather was dying of cancer, and at the same time my sister was around 8 or 9 years old. I had just moved into my university dorm about 1 week earlier. My mother called me one day and said that my grandfather's condition had gotten much worse and that I should be prepared. A few nights later, I woke up sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, feeling extremely cold. My dorm room window was wide open, even though I was on the fourth floor, and as far as I knew, I had never opened it and always kept it locked. It did not make sense to me at all, especially because it was early September and still fairly warm outside, even at night. Around 5 in the morning, my phone rang, and it was my mother telling me that my grandfather had passed away a few hours earlier. She also mentioned something strange, explaining that my sister had woken up in the middle of the night talking in her sleep, pointing at the window in her room, and repeatedly saying, "Granddad." My mother assumed it was just a bad dream. I never told her about my open window, but the coincidence deeply unsettled me. I later told my brother about this, and he did not believe me at all. I am not sure I truly believe in ghosts or anything like that, but I have always felt that it was possibly my grandfather saying goodbye to us. Story 12. Back in high school, my friends and I loved going ghost hunting and doing that kind of thing, and we went almost every other weekend all year long. We made a lot of great memories, and one truly messed up one. We had heard about this supposedly haunted barn about 30 minutes outside of our already small town, and the rumors said that a deranged farmer had shot his family and then hanged himself, which sounded like a typical haunted story. When the weekend came, the five of us met in town around midnight, got into my mother's car, and headed out to the barn. We were joking around, telling stories, and blasting music on the drive. As my friend guided me to the location, we turned onto a gravel road where trees blocked the sky the entire way, and eventually we spotted the barn off to the right, down a narrow covered path. Across the road there was also an abandoned shack or house with a flimsy screen door. We parked, got out, and one guy decided to stay in the car as a lookout while the rest of us crept toward the barn, laughing and talking. Suddenly everything went quiet, and we all stopped talking at the same time. Right then we heard something moving in the bushes, and seconds later a group of crows suddenly burst out of the ground, circled overhead, and flew straight to the barn. We were scared but decided to keep going anyway. Less than 10 steps later, the bushes shook again, but this time it was not birds. A tall, dark, skinny figure slowly rose up from behind the brush, with no visible face and no clothes, just a solid shadow. We all ran, completely panicked, and not very gracefully, and I personally turned and tripped, thinking for a moment that I was done for. After we made it back to town and talked about what we had seen, we noticed something on my mother's car, a muddy handprint perfectly outlined under the back driver's side door handle. We assumed it was mine since I had fallen, but my hand was far too small, and none of our hands matched it. Story 13. Years ago, when I was around 10 or 11 years old, I was part of the Boy Scouts, and we went on a camping trip. There was a lake down a hill from our campsite, so two friends and I decided to go explore a bit. None of us realized how quickly daylight disappears once the sun starts setting, and before we knew it, it was getting dark. We started sprinting back toward the camp, but I tripped several times and ended up falling behind in the darkness. I really needed glasses back then, and combined with the low light, I was practically blind. I wandered in what I thought was the general direction of the camp, and eventually I saw a figure who appeared to be about my age. The figure motioned in the direction of the camp, so I followed. And when I turned around to say thank you, they were gone. I could not clearly make out their features because of the darkness, but I distinctly remember them looking paler than a person should. I do not know why, but I immediately trusted the figure and felt strangely at ease around it. I know it was not someone from my group because they were not wearing the uniforms we all had on. Story 14. This is something that happened recently and is completely unexplainable to me. I was ordering pizza from Pizza Hut, and there are two locations in my town, so I made sure to call the one closer to my house for pickup. When I arrived to get my order, the employee told me they had no order under my name. I explained that I had called it in, and both she and her coworker were confused because they were the only ones answering the phones. I showed her my phone call history, and she confirmed that I had called their store number. The woman who took my order on the phone had a strong Asian accent, but there were no Asian employees working there. Everyone was confused, but I placed my order in person and had about 20 minutes to wait while it was made. I decided to drive to a nearby convenience store to get some sodas, And on the way, I saw a large, pure white dog walking along the street. The dog looked well cared for, but was limping, so I felt I should try to help it before it got hit by a car on the busy road. Every time I called out to it from my car, the dog ran, but I kept circling the block, determined to help since I had already decided it was my problem. Suddenly, I saw a woman running down a connecting street, and somehow I just knew she was the dog's owner. I pulled up next to her and told her to get in because I had seen where her dog went, and she jumped in without hesitation. We drove around for about 10 minutes chasing the dog as it ran confused through the streets, and she explained that the dog was like her child and had gotten loose while her sister was watching it, while her brother was also driving nearby trying to help. Every time the dog ran across the road, she screamed, and I held my breath because traffic was heavy and fast. We eventually pulled back near the convenience store and saw the dog being grabbed by her brother. The woman broke down crying with relief and hugged me, and I started tearing up too because it felt like an intense moment of connection between strangers. Even though I barely helped, I was only there because of the strange situation with the pizza order, and I know I did not call the wrong number because I had confirmed the location with the woman on the phone. It felt like some strange overlap of realities made sure I was in the right place at the right time to help her find her dog. And I sometimes wonder if somewhere else a Pizza Hut employee wondered why no one ever came to pick up that order. Story 15. About 1 year or so ago, I was working the night shift in information technology support and was just settling in when my phone rang. It was around 11:30 at night, and it felt strange that my wife would call so late instead of sending a message. When I answered, she was frantic and told me I needed to get home immediately because Chloe, who was 5 years old at the time, had seen someone at the back door, that there was a man there, and that she was completely hysterical. I could hear Chloe in the background, muffled because she was hiding under the bed covers, shouting for me and crying for help. Chloe had gotten up to ask for some water, and my wife had told her to go get a drink from the kitchen. We have French doors that open onto the back garden, and Chloe could not reach the light switch at that time, so the only light would have been coming from the living room. My wife heard her screaming and ran to her bedroom, where Chloe kept saying there was a man at the door and at the window, and that he had no face. I immediately ran from my desk, telling my boss as I went that someone was trying to break into my house. When I got home, Chloe was still hysterical and grabbed me tighter than she ever had before. This was not the brave and smart child I knew, nor a normal fear of the dark, but pure terror over what she believed she had seen. I grabbed a hammer and a flashlight and went into the garden, but it had been raining heavily, so it was impossible to see any footprints, although the back gate was swinging open. When I asked Chloe to explain what she saw, she told me there was a man standing with his back to the door, looking toward the garden, who then turned and looked at her through the window, and that he did not have a face. Story 16. This is not really something I saw, but something that happened to me. I was traveling in Japan during the summer, and while I was in Kyoto, I visited an antique store. Kyoto is an ancient city, so it is easy to find very old objects in places like that. I bought a Hanya mask, which represents the demon of a scorned woman in Japanese folklore. There are 3 variations of this mask, with dark red symbolizing pure evil, and the one I purchased was dark red. I traveled to Osaka with the mask in my bag and kept it on the desk in my hotel room. That night, I had an absolutely horrifying experience. It felt like lucid dreaming, where I kept waking up and being aware of my surroundings while still trapped in a dream. My phone, which I had recently repaired, appeared to be broken again, and when I checked the map on it, it kept showing a destination back in Kyoto that I did not recognize. This built up until I received an incoming call from a number that was not really a number at all, but an endless sequence of digits. When I answered, there was a voice screaming on the other end. That dreadful feeling stayed with me for nearly 3 days afterward, and I got rid of the mask soon after. I am not a superstitious person, but it was an awful experience, and I am convinced that something negative was attached to that mask. Story 17. In my early 20s, I worked as a security guard at a local cemetery in my city, and after the first couple of weeks, the novelty of the job wore off. Whenever there was reported activity in the cemetery after closing hours, I became irritated instead of scared, assuming it was disrespectful teenagers knocking over stones, breaking things or vandalizing graves. The cemetery was about 250 years old and located in a wooded area with hills, valleys, and dark pockets where homeless people sometimes stayed, though it was usually teenagers causing trouble. If they were just hanging around, I would tell them to leave. But if they were damaging tombstones, mausoleums, or monuments, I would call the police and chase them off, because those structures are expensive and represent someone's final resting place. One night, about a year into the job, I was working an overnight shift. During overnights, we drove the paths, checked known problem areas, walked short routes, and responded to motion sensor alarms. Most alarms were triggered by animals or branches, but sometimes it was people. Around 4 in the morning, a motion sensor alarm went off near a local university, and I assumed it was teenagers again. It was mid-July, and the night was extremely hot. I parked the cart a few paths away to avoid being heard and approached on foot. I knew the cemetery layout very well and rounded a corner near the Johnston family mausoleum, expecting to see people in a small clearing ahead, but there was nothing there. I searched with my flashlight and found nothing, then stopped briefly on the mausoleum steps and looked out again. This time, something was there. A black shape darker than anything I had ever seen, accompanied by an overwhelming feeling of dread, like a certainty that I was in danger. I tried to make sense of it, wondering if it was just a shadow, but I realized it was moving toward me, and the fear intensified. I ran back to the cart and turned the key, and as the headlights came on, they illuminated everything except the shape itself. The light seemed to bend around it, leaving only a void, like a gap where nothing could be seen, and it was still moving. I drove back to the administration building in the well-lit, newer section of the cemetery, and the feeling disappeared. After that, I refused to respond to alarms in that area. When I later told my supervisor, she laughed and said people had been reporting that for years and called it the shade. I have never gone back to that part of the cemetery up close, and although I sometimes look toward the clearing during the day, I never saw it again. Story 18. My family's house is right next to a parking lot and an abandoned house that is known for people using substances, so it is easy for someone to walk up to a window and look inside, which has happened a few times, but by far the scariest incident happened earlier this year. I went into the kitchen very late at night, probably around 2 in the morning, to get something to eat, and I saw a person standing in the bathroom, rummaging through the medicine cabinet, which was dimly lit by the outside motion-activated light. I was absolutely terrified because I knew the only people who live in the house are my grandmother, my mother, and me, and none of us are taller than 5 feet 1 inch, while this person was at least a full foot taller than me. I ran upstairs and urgently tried to wake my mother, telling her that someone had broken into the house, but she kept insisting it was probably nothing and told me to let her go back to sleep. After about 2 minutes of trying to wake her, she finally got up to check, went into the bathroom, and found nothing there. Later that week, she asked me if I had opened the windows downstairs because they would not lock properly, but she still did not believe me and said I must have mistaken someone walking outside for someone being inside the house. Story 19. When I was around 17 years old, I was dating a girl who was severely depressed, and I stayed with her because I thought I could somehow fix things, which in hindsight was a bad idea, but I was young and genuinely loved her. One night I was at her house, it was late, and we were lying in her bed talking and slowly drifting off to sleep. She fell asleep first, and as I lay there awake, I suddenly felt an intense and unsettling sense of dread. I rolled over and swear I saw someone standing in the doorway, but all I could make out was a dark silhouette. I panicked and woke her up to tell her what I saw, and she calmly said that it had happened to her multiple times before. That did nothing to calm me down, so I got up and went downstairs to the living room, since her bedroom was at the top of a long, creepy staircase. The overwhelming feeling of darkness did not go away, so I told her I wanted to leave and asked her to come with me. Before she could answer, we both heard a voice or noise coming from the basement, and whether it was real or just fear playing tricks on us, I did not want to take any chances. I begged her to come with me so we could just drive around and get out of the house, but she looked at me with a cold expression and said that she deserved whatever was happening and that I needed to leave. Normally I would have argued, but I left immediately. Later that night and into the morning, she sent me a flood of messages saying hateful things and claiming she had hurt herself, something she had struggled with before, and blamed me for leaving. The next day, she acted as if everything was fine, and we never spoke about that night again, and we did not stay together much longer, which was ultimately for the best. I have only told one friend this story, and I am not sure if he fully believed me, but the experience is burned into my memory in a way I wish it was not. Story 20. When I was younger, my friends and I used to spend nearly every weekend pulling all-nighters at a friend's house, drinking beer, listening to music, and just hanging out. Occasionally, we would sneak onto the local golf course at night and mess around playing games like hide and seek. One night, my girlfriend at the time and I were chosen as the seekers, while around 10 other people hid in small groups, and one friend was known for running off on his own to jump out and scare people for fun. As we walked across the course, we came out of a tree line and onto an open green, and at the far end, we saw a figure standing there. We immediately assumed it was our friend and called out to him, but the figure turned toward us and started sprinting in our direction. As he got closer, we realized it was not our friend at all, but a man with long hair and a beard who looked homeless. He ran straight toward us, passed right by us at full speed, and continued running to the right before jumping over a fence and disappearing. The most unsettling part was that our friends were hiding only about 20 meters away, and later told us they saw us standing there and heard us calling out, but never saw anyone run past us the way we described. Story 21. When I was younger, about 14 or 15 years old, I was at a friend's party one night out in the woods. A new road was slowly being built as people bought lots deeper into the wooded area, so there were no streetlights, only moonlight and the glow from nearby houses when you stepped outside. The girl who lived there told us there was a haunted house down the road that nobody had lived in for years, so of course we decided to go check it out. It was a very old wooden shack that was almost falling apart. When we arrived, I noticed a car parked in front of it and made a mental note of it, an old Oldsmobile that was either black or dark brown, but I did not say anything at first because I assumed it might belong to a neighbor. We checked the front door and it was locked, then went around to the side where the door was unlocked and barely hanging on. Inside, everything was decomposed, wooden furniture falling apart, and rotten food everywhere, with no signs of anyone living there. Then I saw something that completely shocked me, a cigarette sitting on the countertop, still lit and about halfway smoked. I pulled out my phone and shined the flashlight on it, and it was absolutely real. Thinking someone had to be in the house, I called my friends over to see it, but when we looked again, the cigarette was gone, with no trace of it ever being there. They laughed at me for freaking out, and we went back outside. And when I looked toward the road, the old car was gone too. I assumed maybe someone from across the street had left, but there was no house across the road, and no houses between my friend's place and that shack. We went back to the party and told everyone what we saw around the bonfire, and I mentioned the car and even remembered the license plate, which made everyone laugh and say I must have imagined it. Later that night, a girl showed me a photo taken when we first arrived, and even though it was dark, the flash clearly showed the back of a car with the exact same license plate I remembered, leaving me to wonder whether I saw something paranormal or whether someone really was in that house and left in a hurry when we showed up. Story 22. A friend and I decided to go skateboarding at a nearby golf course, and it was probably around 1 or 2 in the morning. On the way back home, we were walking down a long, dark, heavily wooded 2-lane road on an extremely quiet night when we both heard something jumping through the trees in the distance. At first it sounded about 30 or 40 feet away, and we assumed it was a raccoon or some other animal, so we laughed it off and kept talking. Then we heard it again, but this time it sounded much closer, maybe 10 feet away, right in the trees beside us. We could hear debris falling, heavy rustling, and trees bending and creaking, and it sounded like a fairly large animal. What made it terrifying was how fast it seemed to move without us seeing anything, because when I looked toward where the noise was coming from, the trees were completely still with no branches moving at all. We were terrified and started sprinting, and whatever it was continued jumping from tree to tree directly beside us the entire time we were running. Eventually, the tree line ended near an apartment complex, and we made it home safely. To this day, I still feel uneasy walking down that road, and no one believes the story except the friend who experienced it with me. Story 23. To give some context, this took place in Puerto Rico, and it was a vivid nightmare that I still panic about to this day. I was sleeping in my parents' bed when I felt myself float out of my body, step off the bed, and look back to see myself sleeping. I walked out of the house by passing straight through the door and felt like I floated all the way to the beach, which was about a 5-minute drive away, then began walking calmly along the sand. Everything felt peaceful until the waves suddenly grew louder and more violent, and I felt something calling me into the ocean. The moment my feet touched the water, panic flooded my body. My skin felt like it was crawling with ants, and the beach grew darker and more threatening. From the horizon, I heard a distorted sound that I somehow understood as a warning to leave immediately, and the sky shifted from deep night blue to a dull gray. I felt hands pushing me back toward the house, and every time I tried to look behind me, my neck would tighten as if I was being choked. I would feel pinched or slapped, or hear a voice telling me to stop, or it would get worse. The journey back was nothing like the calm trip to the beach, and as I moved through the neighborhood, I saw people peeking out from their homes while I felt overwhelming fear and shame. When I reached the house, the being that pushed me spun me around violently, and I saw a tall, pale figure with holes for eyes, bloody gums, mismatched hands stitched onto its arms, and a body covered in fungus and maggots. It leaned close to my face and screamed that if I ever did that again, I would stay with it next time. I woke up drenched in sweat, but what made it worse was that I woke up to scratching sounds on the wooden walls, and my parents woke up at the same time. It was 3 in the morning, and I felt like something inside me had permanently changed, like I had lost my innocence. For months afterward, I suffered from insomnia, night terrors, and recurring versions of the same nightmare, while my parents dismissed the sounds as our dog or nearby trees. Even now, I sometimes feel the dream starting again and force myself awake in fear, and I still do not understand what caused it because I had no trauma or anxiety before that night. Yet after it, I was never quite the same. Story 24. I had what I can only assume was a paranormal experience. When I was serving, our old barracks was supposedly haunted, and the building itself had originally been a hotel. Because of that, all the doors had key cards to unlock the handle, a bolt you could lock once inside, and a small metal swivel latch to keep the door secured while it was cracked open. One night I was asleep when I suddenly woke up completely paralyzed. I could not move at all, and I was trying desperately to wake my body so I could reposition and fall back asleep. Something that had happened to me before. Suddenly I heard a key card swipe at my door, and I thought to myself that the duty officer must have decided to inspect my room while I was sleep paralyzed, and that this would make a great story later. Then I heard the door slam shut as the bolt was locked, and I felt relieved, thinking that at least I had locked it, and whoever it was would move on to someone else, even if I was going to get in trouble later for locking it. Then out of nowhere, the bolt unlocked itself. I immediately realized that this could not be happening because the bolt cannot be unlocked from the outside, and I assumed I must still be asleep and about to have a nightmare, even though I rarely have nightmares. The door slowly opened and closed, and I swear I could feel something enter the room. Then I heard a childlike laugh, and I relaxed for a moment, convincing myself it was my buddy from across the hall playing a prank. I tried desperately to speak, hoping that even if it was a dream, he might respond normally. Then whatever it was sat down on the edge of the bed, and I felt the weight shift the entire mattress. I was straining with everything I had to wake myself up, my entire body screaming to move. Suddenly, I felt something that was not a human hand grab my arm, and I was lifted off the bed by that arm and slammed violently to the floor. I instantly woke up and realized I was lying on the floor in the exact position I had just been slammed into, with nothing else in the room and the lights still off. I struggled to catch my breath because the wind had been completely knocked out of me, and once I could finally move again, I stood up and searched the room, finding nothing but myself. Then I realized I was completely naked, even though I knew I had fallen asleep wearing my boxers like I always do. I also noticed my bed was perfectly made with tight hospital corners, as if it had not been slept in at all, and my boxers were neatly folded and put away. When I checked the door, The bolt was locked, even though I never locked it and was not allowed to, since duty needed access to every room at all times. Something had been in my room that night, and I still cannot explain it. Story 25. This happened during the summer when I was visiting my girlfriend, who lives near a large city close to where I live. It was a hot and sunny day, and as it started getting dark, probably around 8 in the evening, we decided to go for a walk to find a quiet, secluded spot to spend some private time together. We found an old biking trail and decided to follow it to see where it would lead. After walking for about 20 minutes, we both started to feel like something was off. I suddenly noticed how dark it had become and how hard it was to see, and at the same time my girlfriend asked where the moon had gone. I looked up and realized there was no moon in the sky and no stars either. Then everything around us went completely silent. Not just quiet, but unnaturally muted, as if all background noise had been shut off. That silence did not last long, because in the distance we heard an otherworldly sound that I can only describe as an almost alien screech, like a high-pitched growl coming from something severely distressed and in terrible agony. My girlfriend turned around, I grabbed her hand, and we ran as fast as we could back toward her house. The entire time it was extremely dark, and we could hear that growling sound behind us, not fading away, but seeming to keep pace with us, maybe even getting closer. We eventually made it back to her house safely, but the experience terrified us, and even now it still gives me chills. Looking back, the idea that our plans were ruined by something that felt completely unexplainable is oddly funny in a dark, unbelievable way, but in the moment it was one of the scariest experiences I have ever had. Story 26. It is not really scary anymore, but at the time it absolutely terrified me. And the creepiest part is that I still do not have any explanation for it. I was camping at a lake with my family when I was probably around 7 years old, and my great-grandfather had been talking about finding turtle eggs on the beach, so I was extremely excited to try to find some myself. When I noticed some sand at the base of a tree in our campsite that looked disturbed, I started digging in it to see what might be there. Suddenly, something that looked almost like a plant stem came out of the sand, opened up into a pale, four-leafed, spiky flower shape, and I swear it looked directly at me before closing back up and pulling itself back down into the sand. It startled me so badly that I froze in fear. I immediately ran to my mother and tried to describe what I had seen as clearly as I could. But like most parents, she did not believe me and said I just had an active imagination. I desperately wanted to go back and dig in the sand again to figure out what it was, but I was too unsettled, and I decided that if even my mother did not know what it was, then it might actually be dangerous. I always assumed that as I got older and learned more, I would eventually come across a logical explanation for what I saw, but to this day I am still completely baffled. I have told this story many times over the years, hoping that someone might finally be able to explain what that thing was. Story 27. A group of friends and I enjoy exploring abandoned buildings, and being from Scotland, there are quite a few to choose from, including old nursing homes, hospitals, Victorian-era buildings, and farm structures. Most of them look and feel exactly like the beginning of every horror movie you have ever seen. And it is very easy to scare yourself if you let your imagination run wild while listening to the wind blowing through broken windows and floors creaking from age and weather. We rarely encounter other people because we are careful not to disturb places that might be occupied by homeless individuals or squatters, and we usually watch a building for 10 to 15 minutes before entering to make sure we are alone. One evening, we explored a large Victorian-era care home that had burned down in the 1960s, and we had read on an urban exploration forum that the fire may have been an insurance job, which already made the place feel unsettling. The building had 4 floors, with the top floor completely stripped of flooring and the bottom floor serving as a basement where staff once lived. We explored the ground floor first and found some old tables and chairs, nothing particularly interesting, and it was starting to get dark. We then reached the top of the stairs leading down into the basement, which was a long tunnel with rooms branching off on each side. At the far end of the tunnel stood a young girl, maybe in her late teens, wearing a t-shirt and jeans, who silently gestured for us to follow her before turning and running into one of the rooms. My instinct was to follow, but something felt deeply wrong because she seemed far too calm. And despite the poor lighting from our weak flashlights and gaps in the brickwork above, she appeared to be smirking. We immediately turned around and rushed back up the stairs, and as I reached the top step, I heard someone on the first floor landing sternly shushing another person, loudly repeating for them to be quiet. We ran back to the car expecting someone to chase after us, but no one ever did. We have returned to that building a few times since, and it has always felt deeply unsettling. Story 28. I got home from work a little early, around 4:30 in the afternoon, and at the time I was living in a three-story apartment complex. As I walked up the stairwell, I heard what sounded like a woman struggling, and with each step I took, the sound became quieter. When I reached the second floor, I stopped to consider whether I should investigate. And at the same moment, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of dread, mixed with a surge of rage I had never experienced before. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash that sounded like a pot or pan hitting the floor, and without thinking, I dropped everything I was holding and ran up to the third floor. When I arrived, I heard a man screaming with reckless rage, and while I cannot remember his exact words, I knew instantly that this was not a normal argument, but something far more sinister, like pure hatred taking control. It was easy to identify which apartment the noise was coming from, so I approached and threw the door open, which was thankfully unlocked. Inside, a man was standing over a woman who was completely broken. I will not go into too much detail, but her nose was broken, her jaw was misaligned, there was blood everywhere. She was completely naked, and her body was covered in lash marks, old scars, and countless bruises. What happened next is blurry because I do not remember striking him, but according to the police report, I did, and I had bruises on my knuckles to support that claim. Apparently, after being hit, he retreated, which allowed me to pick the woman up and carry her out. I remember clearly that a neighbor had already called the police and had her door open. And when she saw the woman's condition, she led us inside her apartment where I did everything I could to manage the bleeding from her nose and cover her wounds until help arrived. The police and an ambulance eventually arrived and took statements, and because I knew one of the officers personally, I was able to follow the case afterward. The woman never pressed charges, despite having endured abuse like this multiple times, and the man faced no real consequences. To this day, I live with the regret that I did not do more to stop him, and I constantly worry that she returned to him and continues to suffer. That experience changed the way I see the world, made me deeply afraid for the women around me, and left me painfully aware of how much violence goes unseen, while also giving me a new understanding of how often police officers are exposed to the worst sides of humanity. Story 29. One evening when I was working at a Barnes& Noble cafe in downtown Pittsburgh during the years 2003 to 2004, a well-dressed, middle-aged, business-looking woman with her hair pulled back into a tight bun approached the counter, pulling a wheeled suitcase with a briefcase attached. As she reached me, she suddenly began speaking in a deep, distorted voice that sounded completely unnatural, almost like she was possessed, and then just as suddenly regained control and politely asked for a tea or a coffee in her normal voice. I made her drink and she sat down nearby, but every so often she would slip back into that same disturbing voice. At the time, I was in my early 20s and thought it was strange but almost funny, so I cleaned tables near her to try to understand what she was saying. After a short while, I went to the back and tried calling my roommates, but no one answered, so I left a voicemail joking that I had officially met Satan. When I came back out, the novelty had worn off, and I just felt uneasy. As my coworker and I were nearly finished cleaning before closing, I left the counter to use the restroom, and that woman followed me in. She stood directly in front of my stall, and I could see her feet beneath the door, when she suddenly said in that same distorted voice that she had heard what I said and angrily cursed me. Panicking, I pulled my clothes back on and loudly said there was someone in the restroom. She then calmly turned and entered the next stall. I tried to leave quickly, but her luggage blocked the exit, forcing me to squeeze past it. I ran back to the cafe and told my coworker, who convinced me to report it to the store supervisor, who said he would remove her from the store. The strangest part was that we closed about 20 to 30 minutes later, and no one ever saw her leave. The cafe was right by the exit. The supervisor was watching, and they checked the restroom, but she was simply gone. When I got home, my roommates asked what happened with amused smiles, but I was shaken to my core. And after that night, I never again made jokes about someone who seemed off. Story 30. I was home alone with my cousin one night when I was a young teenager, sitting in the living room of my old Victorian-style childhood home that had been built in the 1800s. The house had a large entryway leading to a main staircase, and before reaching the second floor, there was a small landing and a narrow claustrophobic staircase that led down toward the back of the house, originally used by servants, which we jokingly referred to with an inappropriate name because we were kids. While we were sitting there late at night with my dog beside us, we suddenly heard an incredibly loud crash that lasted at least 5 seconds. The best way I can describe it is like a large plastic stereo tumbling violently down that narrow staircase, sounding heavy, hollow, and powerful enough to echo through the entire house. We froze for a moment and then rushed to the staircase, only to find absolutely nothing there. It felt surreal because the noise had been so loud, yet there was no evidence of anything falling, and we searched the entire upper floor without finding a cause. About 1 year later, during renovations to a bedroom directly above those stairs, we broke into a wall and discovered a sealed compartment that looked like a hidden closet between the bedroom and the hallway. Inside were stacks of old newspaper clippings, a small collection of old coins, and most disturbingly, a framed Victorian-style portrait of a woman propped upright in the corner. There was a nearly identical portrait hanging downstairs when we first moved in, and we believed they depicted former owners of the house. To this day, I still think about going back there. Story 31. When I was in either fourth or fifth grade, my father, my former stepmother, and I lived in an old farmhouse about 5 miles outside a small town in West Texas. One fall evening, with school the next day, I went to bed around 9 in the evening, and while lying there, I heard something scratching at my bedroom window, hard and deliberate, like something trying to get inside. Terrified, I went to tell my father, who suggested it was probably a branch and walked me back to my room. Just as we reached the doorway, the scratching happened again, and we both looked at the window to see a pair of red eyes staring in at something roughly my height at the time. My father immediately ran outside, but whatever it was fled as he opened the back door. When he came back inside, he was visibly shaken and said he had seen it transform from something almost human into a coyote before disappearing into the darkness. It never returned, but ever since then, strange things have followed me in many of the places I have lived. Just a few weeks ago, a framed sonogram picture of my daughter was pushed off a cabinet and onto the floor, even though it had been sitting nearly a foot from the edge. And my husband and I have also heard a woman's voice in our room when everyone else in the house was asleep. Story 32. I was about 11 years old when this happened, lying in bed one night watching television after I had just gotten cable in my room, forcing myself to stay awake to watch Andrew Dice Clay on Saturday Night Live. I kept drifting off and waking myself back up, and as I lay there, I suddenly felt that unmistakable sensation that someone was staring at me through my bedroom window, a mix of fear and anxiety that I tried to brush off as imagination. I told myself to stop being afraid and just turn around and look, and when I did, I saw exactly what I had feared, a man who had to be around 6 feet 4 inches tall, staring directly at me through the window. I froze instantly, unable to move or scream, and when I tried, only a terrified mumble came out. The man ran off almost immediately, and once my voice returned, I screamed louder than I ever had before. My father came running upstairs from his basement bedroom, and all I could manage to say through my panic was that there was a man at the window. He calmed me down and insisted I must have been dreaming, since I had suffered from night terrors as a child, and he checked outside more to comfort me than because he expected to find anyone. He joked about it occasionally afterward, but the incident was largely dismissed. Even now, as a 42-year-old man, I have never doubted that what I saw was real, and to this day I always keep my blinds fully closed at night. Story 33. Maybe this was not the scariest thing ever, but at the time it absolutely terrified me. I was around 7 years old and asleep in my bed when I suddenly woke up in the middle of the night with a strong, uneasy feeling, like someone else was in the room with me. I wanted to turn on the lights, but I was a spoiled child with a huge bedroom, and it would have taken at least 10 steps to reach the light switch. I decided to run for it and slam my hand on the switch, but nothing happened. I tried again and again, but the lights would not turn on, which made no sense because I had 3 light bulbs, and they could not all have been broken at once. By then I was panicking, so I ran to the door to leave my room, but it would not open. It felt locked, even though the door did not even have a lock. The panic became overwhelming, and I was absolutely sure that something was standing just behind me, about to get me. I ran back to my bed and hid under the covers until morning. When the sunlight finally came in, I looked around the room and saw no one there. So I tried the light switch again, and it worked perfectly, just like it always had, and the door opened normally as well. I went downstairs and later told my family what happened, but no one believed me and said it must have been a dream. I am about 95% sure it was not a dream, and over the following years, I experienced other strange things in that same room, though none were as terrifying as that night, and taken together, they made me believe in paranormal things. Story 34, my cousin's family was very wealthy for a long time, and they lived in a large mansion with a lot of land in Temecula, California, where we would visit every Thanksgiving and Christmas, and often more frequently because my great-grandmother lived in their guest house. This happened a couple of days after Thanksgiving, when my parents allowed me to stay the rest of the weekend. My cousin Jared and I were very close, and always getting into trouble together, exploring the land around his house. Over time, the land was sold and more houses were built, but when I was younger, his house was the only one for more than a mile in any direction. One day we were wandering the dry hills north of his house, carrying a compass and flags to mark our route so we would not get lost, something we had done for years from the time I was 8 until I was 14. That day, I was 13, and we decided to go beyond a large hill we had never crossed before. On the other side, we found nothing interesting at first, just a dirt road, but from the top of the hill, we could not see any houses in either direction, so the road caught our attention. We marked our spot so we would know how to get back and followed the road east as it slowly curved north. The land was mostly flat with shrubs, but soon the road sloped downward, and we found ourselves descending into trees that turned out to be a small forest hidden in a depression. Eventually, the road ended at a rock wall forming a sort of cul-de-sac, and it was very dark under the tree canopy. Around the rock wall, we found small figurines, clothes, toys, and carvings, and part of the wall was coated in clay that was hard, but still soft enough to carve into with rocks, so we carved our names. Jarrett pressed too hard and a chunk of clay snapped off, revealing a perfectly round tunnel behind it, like it had been drilled going back about 10 feet to what looked like a dead end. Using my flashlight, we saw more toys and figurines at the end, along with wet spots, and we thought we heard whispering, but were not sure. I felt a sudden urge to grab one of the toys nearby and throw it into the tunnel, and the instant it hit the end, a small gray hand with extremely long fingernails snapped out from a hidden corner and dragged the toy into the darkness. It looked child-sized but not fully human. We ran back to his house and told his father, who came with us the next day to check in case a child was living out there. But when we returned, everything was gone. No toys, no clothes, no figurines, just my name carved in the clay. The tunnel was still there, with only the wet spots at the end. Jared had kept one figurine, and when he threw it into the tunnel, nothing happened. And his father did not believe us and scolded us for making things up. The next morning, that same figurine was sitting on his bathroom counter, and we both panicked, but his father still refused to believe us. Now I am 28 and Jared is 29, and about 6 years ago, we went back and camped overnight, hearing whispers but seeing nothing. And although camera footage showed nothing definitive, we sometimes saw what looked like the top of a head at the tunnel entrance, which could have been shadows. Even now, we both know we saw something there, and we will probably never know what it was. Story 35. When I was 8 years old, I was living in a house out in the rural parts of Idaho. My bedroom window was about the size of a regular door and faced the front lawn, and there was a small light on the side of the house just outside my window. Sometimes I would sit in the dark and watch moths fly around that light. One night while I was doing this, I noticed something approaching from the far side of the yard. It kept getting closer until I could finally see it clearly. It was slouched forward and roughly 7 feet tall, which is hard to judge exactly because my sense of height has changed since then, but it was definitely taller than an average person. It was completely unclothed and extremely thin, so thin that I could see its bones pressing against pale, papery white skin. Its eyes were large and black,